Thanks everyone for joining. We're just gaining a critical mass of participants and we'll be starting shortly. Well, once again, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Wade Crowfoot and I lead our Natural Resources Agency. And I'm really excited to help host this discussion with water leaders from across our state government. This is one installment of what we call our Secretary Speaker Series, where we bring big ideas and leaders, experts from throughout the state to talk about your priorities, our priorities, to build awareness and understanding of what's happening in state government. First of all, happy Black History Month. This is obviously a month that many of our organizations are celebrating and commemorating. So just a brief plug for events happening within our agency. If you want to learn more about what's happening during Black History Month, if you look at the chat function here today, you'll be able to find events happening across our agency. And of course, our sister agencies presenting here today have their events as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to spend the next hour with key agency leaders across our state government, forming our water team for Governor Newsom, to give you an update on just what's happening with water. It's been a remarkable winter in a remarkable set of years. And so we wanted to share what's happening and give you a real-time update. We'll spend the next almost 60 minutes in conversation. We'll hear from 5 of our leaders: Secretary Yana Garcia, who leads our California Environmental Protection Agency; Director Carla Namath, who leads our Department of Water Resources; State Water Board Chair Joaquin Esquivel, who of course leads our State Water Board; and as well as, of course, Chuck Bonham, who leads our Department of Fish and Wildlife. Once each of them share a portion of the update we wanted to bring today, we're then going to bring everybody together on screen for conversation. And we're working to answer your questions. So if you have questions or comments, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any point during our discussion. And I'll be looking at those Q&A and introducing the questions into our discussion later this hour. So without further ado, let me just say that we have been working, day in, day out to adjust to a changing reality. We know that extreme weather is getting more extreme as a result of climate change. In October, we finished one of the driest 3-year periods in our state's history. And then just last month, we experienced what is probably the wettest 3 weeks in our history. And through that all, we're working to keep communities safe, keep our economies moving forward, and of course, protect our environment. So first up, let me introduce my colleague, Yana Garcia. As I mentioned, Secretary Garcia leads our California Environmental Protection Agency. And Yana, you have sort of the first part of our update today, really setting the picture for what we're dealing with here in California.
Yeah, thanks, Wade. And hi, folks. Good to be here with you all. Thanks for having me in this speaker series. Good opportunity to talk through a little bit about where we are, give maybe a little bit of an update on state of play, and a reminder for some of the role that Cal EPA and its boards and departments play in the aftermath of storms, particularly in recovery, before I kick it over to Director Namath. Just happy to be here with you all first and foremost. I do have some slides, if we could go to the slides quickly. Great. So as Secretary Crowfoot just explained, we are experiencing and have just experienced heavy rains and flooding while in the middle of an unprecedented drought, something that many of us may not have anticipated. And I want to be clear that these storms and likely the rain and snow that we get over the next few weeks did not, nor will they fully end the drought, at least not yet. We're in better shape than we were 2 months ago, but we're not out of the woods. And this winter season has started impressively and gives us an important measurement for now, but an upcoming important measurement will be on April 1st, when the snowpack is typically at its highest. I know Director Namath will hit upon this a little bit more in her remarks. But it's also important to note that, drought impacts vary by location. And this is something that we're seeing even with the rains that we've gotten over the past few months. Hydrologic conditions causing impacts for water users in one location may not represent drought impacts for water users in different parts of California or for users with different water supplies. And the source of the water also really matters. So as many of us know, our groundwater levels are still low, and we're still providing emergency water to many communities whose wells remain dry. And those who depend on the Colorado River face drought impacts from that basin as well, which Secretary Crowfoot, I know, will touch on later. And with statewide precipitation currently well above average, drought recovery will need to be evaluated on a regional scale and will depend on local water supply conditions as we move forward. So all to say, this is a time for cautious optimism, and uncertainty remains about what the remainder of the season may bring. And these storms did result in the wettest 3-week period on record in California, which is impressive. But they've also been followed by an unseasonably dry February. And this wouldn't be the first time we've been teased by heavy precipitation early in the rainy season, only to have our hopes somewhat dashed in the months to come. Just as a reminder, last winter, October and December brought pretty powerful storms as well, but the bounty of those storms was also offset by dry weather in January, February, and March, which was the driest for those months on record at that point. So we really face the reality that a return to dry weather could wipe out some of the recovery we've had this year, and that's a challenging space to be in, but one that we're really hoping we can build in the flexibility to respond to. Next slide, please. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about Cal EPA's role in disaster recovery efforts, and this is something that not all folks are particularly familiar with, but Cal EPA and the California Water Boards have been coordinating closely with local, state, and federal partners during the winter storm recovery efforts to ensure activities that require permitting receive expedited approvals, and to provide any technical guidance on water quality concerns and impacts to drinking water and wastewater services, which is critical. Additionally, Cal EPA and our boards and departments and offices are continuing to support post-flood recovery operations in coordination with the Governor's Office of Emergency Services and local authorities. Many folks are now familiar with our role in the aftermath of wildfires, but in the aftermath of floods, we play a similar role in removing household hazardous waste and non-hazardous waste. So one of our top priorities is to ensure that all household hazardous waste and flood-related debris are properly handled and disposed of to prevent additional impacts to communities. The Department of Toxic Substances Control has been sweeping the neighborhoods of Planeta, where we just were a few weeks ago, and 2 other unincorporated areas of Merced County, removing household hazardous waste from approximately 1,100 properties. And to date, our teams have removed an estimated 3,000 pounds of household hazardous waste and e-waste. And the County of Merced has contracted debris removal contractors, and Cal Recycle has been providing technical assistance and subject matter expertise to assist the county's debris removal program, which is something we've done routinely. The Department of Toxic Substances Control staff are also assisting in Siskiyou County, mitigating 4 parcels where levels of mercury were detected that exceeded the residential cleanup level. Again, really critical work that our boards and departments are engaged in, and really important to protect public health and the environment. Next slide, please. Now, going back to the sort of extremes that we're living in, extreme drought, extreme flooding, extreme heat, and wildfires, all fueled by climate change, I do want to talk a little bit about the governor's water supply strategy announced in August of last year. Now, California's recent weather events are part of the new climate norm, unfortunately, a reality in which weather whiplash requires us to do what we can to achieve better long-term water resiliency so we can help our communities weather these extreme events. This means continued planning for drought resilience and continued planning for high precipitation events so we can better recharge our aquifers and capture stormwater. Last August, Governor Newsom announced an adaptation strategy that targets capturing recycling, desalination, and conserving water supply. California's water supply strategy aims to expand supplies by 1.6 million acre feet by 2030, in addition to creating more than 3 million acre feet of new storage, which is impressive. The water supply strategy also calls on the state to expand average annual groundwater recharge by at least 500,000 acre feet. And we're working together to create incentives to streamline permits and provide technical assistance to facilitate recharge, all while protecting drinking water sources and our groundwater supply. Our strategy intensifies state focus on supply actions in the 2020 water resiliency portfolio and invites the legislature to help modernize regulatory processes to develop projects faster, but safely. Now, I can talk a little bit about our state dollars at work here, and then we'll kick it over to Director Nemeth. But just to give a high level, already California is preparing for our hotter, drier future by leveraging the more than $8.6 billion committed by Governor Newsom and the legislature in the last 2 budget cycles to build water resilience. Since 2020, the State Water Board has provided a total of $1 billion in assistance to 13 projects that will bring a total of 88,000 acre-feet per year to the state's water supplies. 5 of these projects are already complete and are currently providing 25,000 acre-feet of additional storage. Now, the state board has also provided about $176 million for 67 stormwater capture projects funded under voter-approved Prop 1 of 2014. And earlier this month, I had the privilege of visiting one of these facilities, the Santa Monica Sustainable Water Infrastructure Project, which captured 2 million gallons of runoff during the recent storms. And it is expected to capture 40 million gallons of stormwater runoff and urban pollution annually. This was all made possible through a more than $70 million low-interest loan from the Water Board, and this is just one example of how we're using state dollars to invest in our communities and build a more sustainable, climate-resilient future. I look forward to talking to you more about our progress as we move forward in these efforts, and for now, I will kick it over to Director Nemeth. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining all of us. It's my pleasure to be here with my colleagues to talk about what an extraordinary year we're experiencing here in California and why we think it looks more like what's in store for the future and the challenges we all face together to manage such a variable hydrology through the seasons and how to manage it across all kinds of beneficial uses in California, water for people and for the environment. So I think I am starting with a handful of slides. Great. So as you may be aware, our February 1st snow survey up at Phillips Station near Echo Summit, we had more great information on that date. In particular, our statewide snowpack on February 1st was 205% of average. What's really critical about this is, as of today, as of February 21st, our statewide snowpack is now 139% of average. That is an extremely steep drop-off, and it's due to the dry weather that resumed in late January and has really followed us through February, where we've had 0.85 inches of rain in that same period, 0.85 inches of precipitation statewide in California. So that really does tell the story for the challenges that we face over the remaining days of February, March, and April. So next slide, please. So here's a great shot at where we are for our relative snowpack and reservoir storage. So here you see a little bit more updated information relative to snowpack and where we are. It's a little bit thinner in the north. Again, the central and southern parts of the state were the real bullseye of these storm events. But as February has carried on with its dry conditions, that snowpack is really shrinking. And that is going to challenge us relative to our ability to put that water in the ground, which of course the chart on the right tells a very important story relative to water supply reservoirs. But what it doesn't articulate is the much slower recovery that our groundwater basins make. So the state is very focused on doing what we can with the snowpack to get it underground, but that snowpack itself, even where we had these very intense events in the central and southern Sierra, is diminishing. Over on the right, we take a look at our reservoir storage. It tells a very similar story to the snowpack, where reservoirs in Northern California haven't seen the same kind of bump that reservoirs, again, in the central and southern part of the Sierra have. I want to draw your attention to Trinity Reservoir, which is very much below average. As is Shasta. But what's important about those two reservoirs is they operate together in a way that supports our broader system in Northern California. It's good news that Oroville is above average, but the combined challenges that we have in that part of the state, it's still looking like severe drought. So there's been some significant drought relief. No question, we are out of exceptional drought in that part of the state, but it still is categorized as severe drought. We saw pretty terrific bumps. You can see along that central coast, Cachuma is as big as it's been in a decade. And that's, I think, telling a pretty familiar story, particularly for our coastal communities that are very dependent on surface water storage. Those communities were really the first to enter into deep drought. And those are the communities, given that they were very much the bullseye of a lot of these atmospheric river events, you're going to see them emerge from drought as well. Next slide, please. So we did have a very impressive parade of storms. We hadn't seen anything like this since 1924, so there are a few of us around who remember those events to comment on where we are today. But it really was an incredible 9 atmospheric rivers in 3 weeks. We had 1 exceptional atmospheric river, 4 strong, and 4 moderate atmospheric rivers. What's important about this as it relates to flood protection and therefore our ability to manage these intense events for future water supply is the sequence with which they arrive. So a moderate event that comes later in the series tends to produce more flood damage than that same moderate event that enters in the beginning of that sequence of storm events. And that's because when it comes later, the soil is already very saturated. So it really doesn't take much for those creeks to rise and for California to experience very intense localized flooding. And that is indeed what happened in the areas that suffered the most flood damage in California. What it also means is a lot of our flood control is very dynamic on the back end. And what I mean by that is it's really once we get into a flood stage and we reach those flood peaks in those reservoirs, when we start releasing, that becomes a very dynamic situation where we're having that storm come in and our reservoir operators are releasing floodwaters to maintain public safety. Really on the front end, when we see these storms coming in, it's a lot less dynamic, and the rules are very strict in terms of how we need to maintain conditions in our reservoirs. And that's one of the key opportunities into the future with forecast-informed reservoir operations, is to allow our system to be more dynamic in the front end when we see these storms come in, because that enables us to do more with that water, to store it in different places in California. So that's part of our overall policy approach as we move into a story of more rapid extremes in California. I want to emphasize that we had only 3 strong atmospheric rivers in water years 2020 and 2021. So we essentially tripled that in a 3-week time period in 2022. Truly an extraordinary parade of storms. Next slide, please. One of the things that helped us manage this is the research that's gone into atmospheric river events. DWR and my colleagues at the Water Board and other state agencies have been working with our partners to fund this kind of atmospheric river research. Also, some of our local water districts have been very engaged in better understanding what's happening with atmospheric rivers. And so one of the great things that we were able to take advantage of this series of 9 atmospheric rivers was to fly into those storm events and collect that data as these atmospheric rivers piled up. And one key thing we learned, we're still doing a deeper dive with our partners at Scripps and NOAA to really understand what we learned from the extent of these atmospheric rivers. But an early lesson is that the data that we collected as those atmospheric rivers continued, we put that data into our models that can help us understand intensity and landfall. And the model became a lot more accurate because we had such a significant series of events. So you'll hear the folks at Scripps say the atmospheric river that they forecasted for the San Diego region was probably their single most accurate forecasting experience that they've had in their careers, which is really stunning. And that was really because we were able to get all this data going with these C-130s flying out over the Pacific Ocean and testing the different elements of these water vapor streams moving across the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. So some more facts about what this really did for our snowpack, even if it seems that may be tailing off. We had 80% of our full seasonal snowpack in those 3 weeks of storms. Our statewide average precipitation over those 3 weeks was 46% of our full water year. Essentially, we would have expected these kinds of events throughout December, January, and February. Next slide, please. So to give you some hydrologic context, our historic peak is typically in that April timeframe. And we had been at 138% of average peak snowpack. For me, one of the big signals of the last several years is how less and less relevant our April 1st peak snowpack is becoming in California. And I think this year is in all likelihood, we're headed down that path where our April 1 will no longer be our peak snowpack. That creates a lot of challenges for how we manage uncertainty into the future. And that's something that collectively the state administration is very focused on relative to how we manage our systems. I do want to say that the Colorado River system, the upper part of the Colorado, also had some great storm impacts, some great snowpack early in their season, not nearly the scale of what we had in California. And that system, while that kind of snowpack was very much welcome after the intensity of dry conditions, is also not nearly out of drought conditions. And then finally, I can't emphasize enough what Secretary Garcia mentioned, that there is a lot of variability in California in terms of not just hydrologic variability, but also drought exposure variability. And so in many of our communities that are dependent on groundwater, they are not out of a drought, and they will continue to require some emergency services provided by the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board. And then lastly, I'll say that we continue to be focused on the potential developments in the northern part of the state relative to this precipitous decline in precipitation since late January. And that's an area where we're very focused on maintaining carryover storage. We have been operating the State Water Project in a way to balance what we need to be doing for people and the environment, but very much uncertainty that still exists in our system between now and summertime. And that's an uncertainty that's shared both by water for people and water for the environment. It was very important to the department that when these big storms came through and they triggered this first flush where we're moving a lot of sediment into the system, we're supporting not just our native smelt species, but also salmon that are migrating through the system. We very much needed to be careful about how we were operating the state and federal water project pumps at that time. We have continued with monitoring a turbidity bridge, and now we're looking at conserving water up in Oroville, again, particularly given the dynamic with Folsom or with Shasta and Trinity, and the potential needs we have later in the system for flow pulses that are helpful to salmon. If conditions continue on this dry pattern, and if we see this overwhelming trend continue relative to increasing ambient temperatures, the flexibility that storage can provide to enable the State Water Project to meet both environmental needs and meet drought needs in our communities is going to be a real asset as we move through continuing hydrologic uncertainty this year. And with that, I think I move the discussion over to Chair Esquivel. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Really appreciate the opportunity to be joining everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm chair here at the State Water Resources Control Board. I want to thank everyone's participation. I know there's a lot going on, whether it's response to floods and or conditions that we saw in early January, or continued drought conditions in many communities being provided hauled water and otherwise. I know there's a lot going on, so I appreciate this opportunity for all of us to gather to explain some of the work that's been going on. And as Director Namath said, a lot of the balancing that we're having to do, given what are we have to remind ourselves, pretty incredible circumstances. You look at the hydrologic conditions that we're all facing right now, and they're way outside of any norms or modeling that say we're done in previous goes at managing the Bay Delta or the state projects. And here we're all actively really trying to understand best how we manage the new system that we have, one that's here in the 21st century, one that's a lot flashier. We all know that California's water systems, we've always had this variability between years, shifting between flood and drought. And it's why we have the systems that we have. But this inter-year variability is creating a lot more challenges for us. Many of you know, but I think it's helpful to repeat here, the State Water Board is a 5-member board. We, along with our 9 regional water quality control boards, which have their own chairs, are quasi-independent, oversee water quality regulation in the state of California. So anyone discharging into our rivers, bays, streams, or estuaries, or has the potential to impact our groundwater quality, the board is there. Boards are a very public entity, 50-year institution at this point, trying to protect that quality side of what is often a quantity discussion. And I think here, what's exciting about the water supply strategy is it's really about those sources, whether it's through recycling or desal or stormwater capture and groundwater recharge as a continuum of that. Stormwater capture really being on the urban side, groundwater recharge more as we talk about it in rural settings. Important that we protect water quality. That's the long-term highest cost when it comes to any of our use of our water. And so glad to and proud to be doing that work with our regional boards. Additionally, the state board administers water rights. And there, importantly, how and when we take out of the system is so critical, and especially as we talk about groundwater recharge, and I'll touch more about that. And as you all know, in the middle of the drought, how do we ensure that we curtail, that we here manage ourselves to what is actually hydrologically available is so critical. And then additionally, the state board oversees drinking water agencies. So really helping drinking water agencies and communities understand their vulnerabilities to both drought, but also new contaminants, other pressures on things like affordability are really important to the state board. And so when we think about the water supply strategy, what is so exciting is that it is an acknowledgement that we continue to have these pressures on these exported resources on the Bay Delta, the Colorado River, the Klamath, any Mono Lake, any of these resources across the state. And we have to acknowledge that this changing climate that we have is meaning we have to think a lot different about those resources. And so what we do, particularly in moments like this, where there's a lot of water in the system, we're uncertain as to if we're going to continue to see what would otherwise be conditions, usually of a wet year or a dry year, and starts to beg even, how best do we make sure that we're just operating by what's available, operating what we can rationally at this point anticipate, and make the investments that we need in order to reduce that dependency on overstressed sources already. And what is exciting is that there is so much innovation happening around how we capture, when we capture. There's already a lot of recharge that goes on in moments like this. We have floodplains and bypasses, I think the Yellow bypass, that operate to allow for rivers to breathe. And I think that we're all acknowledging that we maybe came in and had a little hubris in trying to improve what were systems that operated over millennia. And so the state board, as Secretary Garcia mentioned, is really focused on, okay, well, how do we operate the system in ways that think of water quality, think of access to communities, but here also think of the opportunities to capture more water. And the board since 2016 has actually issued what are temporary water right permits. We created new tools to be able to actually bank water underground using the water rights system, which I think everyone knows and acknowledges is not the most finessed system to be dealing with, but to do so in a way that protects important things like water quality in communities, but actually gets to getting greater groundwater recharge. I know this year we've already approved 4 projects that are out there. Here, because there's snowmelt, spring melt coming, we're prepared and working with our partner agencies. I want to acknowledge Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Water Resources for being partners with us, and importantly, local communities that are owning what are important safeguards and considerations, and not using sometimes easy excuses amongst us around some assumptions around how governments should importantly step up to what are opportunities amongst us. And I think seeing everyone put aside, I think sometimes some important sort of viewpoints, but sometimes not so helpful, has been encouraging to see. So I'm encouraged by that work that we're doing. It's a continuum of work really on that water rights side with those temporary permits that we're doing, to the urban side, where Secretary Garcia acknowledged we've invested $1 billion over the last 2 years. It's exciting because we really see on the urban side, communities like Los Angeles with Measure W stepping up and saying, we're going to develop our own sources of funding, and being able to then match that with state resources to ensure that stormwater capture in our urban areas becomes a real emphasis and a resource, has been really encouraging to see. I think that as Director Namath and Secretary Garcia mentioned, I do have to acknowledge still that there are many communities that are being served whole water or bottled water. It's a continuum of challenges that small systems have been facing for decades when it comes to access to both quality and quantity issues, and so many of our communities. And I think I'm just going to acknowledge and be very proud that we've reduced the number of Californians that are served by failing systems in California by 40%, going from 1.6 million here in 2019 to 850,000, 900,000 now. Importantly, as the board considers new maximum contaminant limits like chromium-6, that has the potential to have additional systems not meeting quality standards, and really emphasizes the need for all of us to continue to think about how best we support and invest in our water systems. And they're just proud of the $3.3 billion that the board got out in fiscal year 21-22. And again, what we're trying to make sure we're emphasizing and supporting are the local management decisions that are ensuring that stormwater capture, water recycling, desal are becoming important parts of communities' portfolios, and we're thinking about the affordability impacts that has to our community. So glad to be here with everyone. Look forward to chatting further about what we're doing to balance our system, take advantage of these moments, and importantly, really shift our systems to the century that we're now in.
Thanks so much, Joaquin. I would turn it over now to Chuck Bonham, who leads our Department of Fish and Wildlife at the state.
Thanks, y'all. And here's the bottom line, big picture, I think, basic takeaway on the environmental front. Wetter is better. When there's more water, it's better for our ecosystems. And unlike some conventional wisdom you see in these periods that suggest all water to the ocean is wasted, that's actually not the case. So what has happened since the beginning of time is the animal and plants and habitats in California have adapted to variability within a year and variability across years for our hydrology, dry, wet, and the variability. But since the beginning of that time, the biodiversity in our state, so all of our animals and plants, have taken advantage of strategies to benefit from critical high flow periods. And you see those benefits across a variety of kind of disciplines and outcomes. These higher flow events from these rains can shape our rivers and habitats. They move sediment, they move cobbles, they shape the creek and river channel. Those higher flow events disperse salmon. They're a cue for fish swimming out to the ocean. They actually produce benefits in the Delta. And over the last couple of months with the Department of Water Resources, Director Namath, we've actually implemented a series of rules. We, on December 31st of last year, triggered a rule that's called the first flush. It's designed to create an early winter pulse of water through the system to protect spawning habitats and help with migration. And then by the time we got to the middle of January 17, we actually triggered another rule for a full 8 days, what we call first flush protections, to avoid this connectivity of turbidity between the central delta and the south delta, where the large water infrastructure pumps are, to avoid pulling fish into those pumps. You also see increased spawning success across a whole bunch of fish: salmon, white sturgeon, split tail, sucker, hitch, where we see an increase in abundance and population following wet years. These high flow events prime the floodplain. They create more food. So not all water to the ocean is wasted. It serves an essential ecological purpose as well. And here are examples, if you've been in California, where you might have seen some of those things with your own eyes. If you've driven from Davis to Sacramento or Sacramento to Davis, you've gone across one of our major bypasses. It looked like an inland ocean. That's an ecological uplift for the system. So the Fremont Weir, which is part of that infrastructure, began spilling on January 7th and stopped spilling on January 21st. We saw peak flows in the bypass around 60,000 CFS. The Tisdale Weir began spilling on January 5th, stopped spilling on January 22nd. We saw peak flows in that bypass around 17,500 CFS. What does that mean? That means you'll see a recruitment of juvenile salmon, including winter run, into both the Sutter and Yolo bypasses. It means you see a creation of tens of thousands of acres of floodplain rearing habitat. We would estimate approximately 60 to 70,000 acres at those peak flows I mentioned a moment ago. You also see a reduction in invasive aquatic weeds, which itself causes big fish passage problems in both of these bypasses, which were prevalent and persistent during the drought. You get a bunch of other ecological processes that benefit as well. And in the middle of this uplift, and as we were coming out of last year, you see the department investing in a series of must-make actions, in my mind, to deal with this variability. What we're seeing is year over year of increasing dryness compounded with this extreme wetness in the middle of a period. So if you take a snapshot around the state, we've had field staff gauging and collecting data in sentinel streams all across the northern part of the state, down through the central coast. And as an example, in Southern California, which doesn't come up often in conversation around our fish conservation work, we have staff out walking Gaviota Creek in Santa Barbara County, Arroyo Hondo Creek, North Fork Matilaha Creek in Ventura County, the Ventura River, San Paulo Creek, San Antonio Creek, Soledad Canyon in Los Angeles County, dozens and dozens of sentinel creeks where we're out for the last several years collecting water quality data and taking assessments of water quantity. And what we've seen coming out of this storm period is most of those sentinel streams, particularly as you go further south, are 100% wetted. That's a good thing. That's positive. Just take going back up to the northern part of the state, Shasta Reservoir. I think it rose 73 feet since December 1st. Many of us in the middle of the hot, dry summers in the Central Valley landscape are stuck managing a challenging situation for our salmon. It's good news. Shasta rose 73 feet. So in that same space in the Central Valley, I'm convinced one of our core salmon strategies going forward has to be helping fish get back to their historical habitat. The fact of the matter is most of the cold, clean water that remains as possible refugia, particularly for Central Valley run salmon, is above large-scale dams, which are essential for our infrastructure. But for the first time in almost 100 years, and it's by no means the end of the work we must do, but we were able to have salmon back in the McCloud River, way up in the headwaters. We have a lot more work to do to honor our co-management obligations with the Winnem and Wintu, but the McCloud is an example. Over in Battle Creek, for the first time in about 85 years, we had winter run salmon back in historical habitat. If you walk around Battle Creek in the summer, that water is so much cooler, cleaner, and habitable for salmon than if you walk around on the valley floor. That might be our future. If you go over to Butte Creek, we actually did a lot of progressive action to remove the invasive weeds that inhabit the bottom part of the river, which is a key migration corridor for spring run. And of course, I noticed in the chat already, one of the questions is, if we're targeting water capture, why are there dam removals? The answer to that is balance. Trying to make decisions across this incredibly diverse state, balancing public health and safety with the ecosystem benefit. And the fact of the matter is, most of our dams are essential for public health and safety, but not every dam is a monument. In fact, some dams are well past their used and useful life and create grave risks for the environment, which is why in the Klamath Basin, at the end of this year, we have moved into implementation for the world's largest river restoration project to give salmon access to cold, clean water in the up watershed. A lot of conversation in this space, Wade, is about fish. Not as much happens in the general kind of thinking around birds, but let's turn to our winged friends for a moment. And in the same kind of vein, wetter is better. It's good that it rained. We welcome that rain. So what we're seeing in the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge Complex is the winter rains have pushed that federal complex of refuges to near 100% flooded. I mean, they're called wetlands for a reason. And when we can get them wet, it's good for birds. As an example, the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge is 98% flooded. Delavan is 94%. The Butte sinks are about 100%. If we hadn't had those rains, we would have likely been around 70% flooded. And if you think about these rains elsewhere, down in the Kern Basin, the recent wet conditions have allowed us to shift our water from some of our properties over to Kern, where benefits from the wet conditions were not as realized as they were in other places. So in the last survey in December, the Sacramento Refuge Complex recorded, I think, about 484,000 birds, when there would normally be around 1.1 million this time of year. And of course, flooded acres does not equate to additional habitat for birds in all cases, but that it's wetter is a good thing. Similar to some of the earlier panelists, it's not the same everywhere. While I've given you a snapshot of some of our observations in small creeks in Los Angeles being 100% wetted, the place where we have one of our larger challenges right now is up in the Klamath. The Klamath refuges themselves are much drier than every other complex in the state. The main stem of the Klamath River is still in the middle of a difficult tension between lake levels and downstream releases for salmon. On our own properties, we've actually in the last 2 fiscal years put in process about $20 million of water conveyance and habitat projects on our own department lands to modernize our existing infrastructure and build up a more resilient refuge complex for the benefit of birds. I've got a lot more examples, but being the last presenter, it's often the case I have the shortest amount of time and the quickest leash. So I see we only have a few minutes for questions. Back to you, Wade.
Hey, Chuck, thanks so much. We'll put you first in the queue of presenters next time, but that was really a great comprehensive review of all that we're working to do to protect fish and wildlife. So we have a lot of questions coming in. We have just over 10 minutes, so we're going to do a speed round of answers, colleagues here. If we can get to that sort of Brady Bunch view, we'll come into conversation. Just a quick note that my colleague Gita has been populating the chat with all sorts of helpful web links, and know that we are providing that full list of chat links on our speaker series website. So this is recorded, and within the next couple of days, this session will be on the internet on our webpage, as will those chat links. So please know that. So first question is a quick one to Carla. A bunch of folks are seeing some news about upcoming storms. In a few sentences, can we expect more rain and snow here in coming weeks, or you think we have what we've got for the season?
Well, I won't say for the coming weeks, but we are eyeballing this one that's coming in over the next several days and into the weekend. It is making it's getting a little bit colder, which is good. It's also heading a little bit further south. In fact, the San Diego region is expected to see some very significant downpours. From a flood perspective, we're focused on the San Diego River and the potential for some extreme events there. But given the fact that it's cold, that's a good thing to help preserve our Sierra snowpack, maybe arrest some of the decline. But in terms of appreciable additional accumulation, not particularly significant. I think the big story with this storm is our 205% of statewide snowpack down to 139% in a mere 20 days. It arrests that at least temporarily, and that's a good thing.
Quick follow-up question, Carla. Some questions around when will we know sort of overall water supplies headed into the dry season? And I know that's a big question mark, but when are you going to have a sense more of what that looks like? And of course, the most popular question, will we be out of drought?
Yeah, so we will make our final allocation in May. And just, judging from the last couple of years where we've actually gone in reverse, it's not something that we like to do. We're pretty cautious given where we are. The State Water Project has a 30% allocation. We are going to update our allocation in the next couple of days. That would, in all likelihood, be very, very modest, owing to the dry conditions. And we're looking at some of our exceedance plots. If you're into that sort of thing, that's our probability, just to give it some perspective. The last 2 years, we've seen what's called a 99% exceedance become our reality. And that means 99 years out of 100, it would be wetter than what it ended up being. And I will also note that 99% is something that we instituted in 2021 because 2021 outstripped our typical way of thinking about probabilities. So I'm going to lay one more thing on you, and that is Right now, we're looking at a 75% exceedance, showing us a below normal year up in the northern part of the state. So the heart of the system that feeds the state and federal water projects, there's a pretty decent shot we're only going to end up below normal this year.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at the last 2 years, we have a decent shot of it being dry, classified as a dry water year type. So all of it continues to be very dynamic and very uncertain. DWR is committed, especially after 2021, to do as much pre-planning as we can, to be as conservative as we can early in the year, because that's going to give us more flexibility when we get to those warm summer months.
Really helpful, Carla. And so as Yana said, too early to tell just, where we'll end up and how it will impact, different areas of the state on drought impacts. Joaquin, I want to turn to you. A lot of discussion, a lot of effort on our teams regarding how do we capture these flood flows and what will be melting snowpack and help recharge groundwater basins. Can you talk about what we're doing and sort of where we stand as it relates to expanding groundwater recharge?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. What we have done, and I mentioned this, we've definitely created new types of water rights permits, temporary permits, both for 180-day and now a 5-year permit, which really allow an option for folks to not have to go for a full water right. And I think it's important to, again, remember a lot of recharge happens either incidentally or because of these, the running of these large pieces of infrastructure like the bypasses. But as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which I think I saw as a question, does become here more of a reality, I know a lot of communities are looking to be able to quantify the amounts that they're recharging for extraction later on. And that's when it requires a right. And here, because again, there's a need to work in water rights generally, there can be sometimes not the easiest processes. So having these temporary permits lets us have an option. And importantly, we're seeing a lot more folks come to the table and trying to utilize them, and especially because, Sigma is so real out there. And these opportunities, as we're seeing with these increased dry years to really move water, are not coming as frequently as we'd like. So it is really about, as Carla said, moving up earlier into the year, anticipating conditions here in the middle of summer that you might have in the winter, which I know can be hard, but here similarly, we're having to here in wet periods already be thinking about, well, what does the height of summer look like? And I think it speaks to the type of work that we have before us. What I think important to also note is that on the urban side, it's a bit of a different landscape, especially because in Southern California, you often have adjudicated basins already. So it's not so necessarily a need to get permits or work through that, but really about the contamination that might exist already within communities. And that really is front of mind. We have projects, I think, Secretary, like the Tahunga Spreading Grounds, which are really kind of getting at this at dual purpose. It's really about how best are we recharging our basins and managing them, both with stormwater and perhaps recycled water, but also remediating some of these legacy issues that we see, both in that urban side, but also on the rural side, where we're seeing as well, an important consideration as we do groundwater recharge is, are these lands appropriate? Are you going to worsen water quality or contamination issues that we're also dealing with through other programs and state funding? But I think it speaks to the very local nature of the work, and here glad that we're providing more tools, if you will, through these temporary permits. But they also come with a lot of other challenges that are out there that need to be addressed and discussed as we try to think of these systems that they'll be perpetuating, if we do our jobs right, into the decades ahead. Not unlike decades prior, so much good work was invested into the way our water systems work or don't for us. Yeah.
One key takeaway that I have is if water agencies or communities want to do this recharge during these high flow event periods, it takes some advanced planning, and we have state agencies willing to expedite the approval of that. But really the time to prepare is actually before the storm comes. Maybe the last question as we get to the top of the hour here is for Chuck, but really everybody, which is that, question around balance. The governor issued an executive order earlier this week that provides for some dynamic decision-making as it relates to, how do we protect our environment, particularly in our Bay Delta, as water courses through the Bay Delta. But at the same time, that's an important area where we also capture water supply for large portions of the state, Northern and Southern California. So Chuck, Carla, Yana, team, how would you say we're approaching this, and how are we working to achieve the balance between these different beneficial uses, as we call them?
I'll just say something on a real personal level. Having done this maybe too long, it's a state with a lot of diverse opinions. In this kind of moment, I'm basically being yelled at by all kinds of different perspectives. A lot of times the argument is we're making a decision that's too protective for the environment at the expense of people. I hear it from Congress, I hear it from citizens. It's important to hear it. And other times, like in the last couple of days, I've been yelled at for not doing enough to protect the environment. It's really hard in this state. We've got a complex overlay of multiple sets of rules across this delta environment, this estuary confluence of our major rivers, federal, state, local. We've triggered a series of rules so far that have consequences for the environment and the people. And I think this is a hard job trying to balance. We've got more rules coming ahead of us as we go into March, April, and May that are going to be hard fought, with people bringing a lot of different views to it. Carla or Joaquin, you're in the middle of it with me. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Thanks, Chuck. I would add that, similar reaction to Chuck, that, when we are in these scenarios in which there's so much hydrologic uncertainty, I think the department wants to avoid being where we were in 2021 with a decent snowpack on April 1st, but a dramatic drop off. And in front of the board, one, out of compliance, and in front of the board over the summer with TUCPs. And I think what we heard loud and clear from lots of different folks is do better pre-planning. And I just want to acknowledge, the frustration that it generates, even in this year when it seems like things may be hurried and there isn't the public process that, we would all desire, because just given how dynamic the situation became. And I do want to take a moment to speak just very briefly to the petition that the department sent over to the water board. And, we're not looking to waive requirements across the board. We're looking to treat one standard that's an important standard, but treat it as if it's essentially an average year, which is what it's really trending to become, particularly in this part of the system. We are very focused on the flexibility that Oroville carryover storage provides in the later months to do important things, not just for winter run salmon, but potentially for fall run with fish pulses in the Feather River. And this kind of an action, while we're focused on very important ESA and California ESA protections right now for salmon species, and it's all eyes on making sure there isn't entrainment at the pumps and adjusting as needed. We think that combination, plus some of the benefit of the early intense pulses in January, gives us a better shot at balancing across species needs much deeper into the season if conditions continue with their dryness. And so some of it is not simply, people and the environment, it's also managing across species needs, also in a very dynamic hydrology deeper into the season. And that's what we're working to do. And that's what we're working to do in a very dynamic situation. And That's the department's approach, and I do just want to acknowledge just the pain that it causes people and the challenges that it causes people to not have sort of desired in-depth public process, which I think has been a goal that the department has shared together with the water board on drought conditions that have preceded this. But this is where we are with just very dynamic hydrologic conditions.
Yeah, very complex decisions, as our participants can hear, but having to be made in real time, really to manage what is these weather extremes. Joaquin, any thoughts?
No, I want to be careful. I know, we're a full board. There's other board members. I don't want to speak for them, but I will speak for myself in saying that we are outside of real conditions that we've seen before, and water year types. Sometimes land or don't in the right way, and here we are having to be far more flexible. But thinking not just of this action in its singularity, really looking over the last 2 years of decision making before the board, where enacting water rights curtailments, ensuring conservation, and here all of us better understanding how we can contribute to what we need to be doing, which is better balancing what we know are declines in our species. And I think that what it opens up opportunities to do is really think across the water year types, not just in this individual year, but already thinking about next year and what resources we might have, and how when we are protective, being far more explicit. And I think what again, I'm really looking across the last 2 years, see is how best do we balance across that system writ large, knowing that we just don't and can't count on what were historical averages at this point that don't really pan out. We have to kind of take the water year as it is and understand how we best strike a continued balance.
Thank you, Joaquin. I want to, in a moment, give our last word to Secretary Garcia as one of the leaders of our water team. But I'll just say, my takeaway is that parade of storms in January, as Carla labeled them, brought destruction and danger, but it also brought remarkable rain and snow. And as Chuck said, wetter is better for the environment, for fish, for birds, but it's also much better for our water supply, as Carla pointed out. That being said, we're clearly not out of the woods. If we've learned anything over the last few years, it's how quickly things can change. And as Carla mentioned, that snowpack that looked so incredible in the beginning of February, has waned as we get deeper into the season with drier conditions. So a lot still ahead of us, even this spring, as we determine how this impacts the drought and how we manage all of these needs, of course, that we have throughout the state. Yana, thank you so much for your partnership and leadership. And let me give you the last word of the session.
Sure. Tough acts to follow. Thanks, you all. And I guess, I think all the points that were hit on by my colleagues pretty much sum up the challenge of the situation that we're in, which I say without discounting the challenge that all Californians find themselves in. I think given the situation of climate change, drought, and the structures that we've inherited in many ways. I think the one thing I'll just say is, we weren't able to get to so many of the questions in the chat, and they are very well taken. Please know that we're taking them into consideration and that they're not falling on deaf ears. So thank you very much for those. And again, thanks for holding this, Wade, and look forward to talking to you all again soon.
Yana, thanks so much. And James, my colleague, if you can bring up the last slide, there is an email. If you have suggestions or questions on this session or for other sessions, please let us know. We were joined by over 600 people in this discussion here today. Many thanks for your participation. And once again, within the chat here, you will see the website, the subpage of our Natural Resources Agency website, where you can find a recording of this discussion, as well as a copy of all of those links that were provided by my colleague, Geeta. Once again, thanks so much for joining. Have a great week, and we'll talk again soon.